Hey guys, it's Celestia, and I'm really excited for today's video. I've got a lot of awesome announcements for you all, which I'll save for the end of the video, and a fun, lighthearted topic that I've wanted to make for a while now, which is how I improved my art more than ever before in 1 year. So in total, I've been drawing relatively seriously for about 10 years now, and I've been pursuing it seriously as a career for about 6. But throughout all of that time, I devoted very little of it to actively, consistently trying to improve my art. It's not like I didn't want to improve, but there was always something holding me back from committing to putting the time and effort into making it happen. In the beginning, I was trying to finish high school remotely and get out of a dangerous living situation, and there was so much else going on in my life that I ended up taking really long, sporadic breaks from art that really hindered any significant improvement or growth. And then as time passed and I started trying to make art into my job, I made the mistake of focusing on quantity over quality, which resulted in me drawing tons and tons of mediocre art rather than trying to make fewer but higher quality pieces. Because I wanted to have enough prints and buttons and other stuff to actually have stock to sell. I talked more about this in my video about the mistakes I made when starting my art career, linked in the card above, but suffice it to say that it resulted in some very long-term stagnation when it came to my growth as an artist. But when quarantine hit, I started playing a lot of League of Legends, which sounded like a better segue in my head, but bear with me. Basically, I hate League. Truly, the game is a dumpster fire that I made the mistake of selling my soul 2 years ago, and now I can't get it back. But one of the few things I do genuinely and wholeheartedly love about it is the art. And spending all that time in quarantine staring at the gorgeous splash art of all the champions while loading into my 9th consecutive game at 4 in the morning eventually resulted in me getting really jealous, because I really wished I could draw like that. It actually made me so jealous that I almost gave up on my own art, because I felt like I would just never, ever be on that level, so there was no point in trying. I started hating drawing, because nothing came out looking anywhere near as good as the professionals that I wanted to be like. And it made me pretty goddamn miserable for a long-ass time. And eventually I came to realize that I only had 2 choices if I wanted to stop being miserable: quit art or throw myself into getting better at it. So around mid to late 2020, I threw myself into getting better at it. And while I'm still not as good as League splash artists or anywhere near as good as I want to be, I have improved a hell of a lot since then, and I'm really proud of that. So with that in mind, let me tell you guys the biggest things that I've learned after a year of studying, practicing, and actively working to grow as an artist. And let me start with that by thanking today's sponsor, Wingfox, because learning platforms like theirs that are dedicated to helping artists learn and improve are some of the biggest things that helped me. For a long time, I was under the antiquated impression that the only real option artists have for education is art school, largely because that's what most of my generation was raised to believe, at least as kids and young adults. And obviously, I mean, we've all heard of Skillshare at this point in the year 2022, so everyone these days knows that's no longer the case, and you don't need me to tell you that. You can learn anything through online classes now, and it's completely transformed the way that people approach education for the better. But what sets Wingfox apart from your average online learning platform is that it is 100% dedicated to art. Their whole platform is exclusively for artists, offering courses from leading industry professionals all around the world, covering pretty much any type or genre of visual art that you can imagine. I'm currently working on the Level Up Your Digital Painting Skills course, and let me tell you, I was not in any way prepared for how thorough it is. I've taken a million online art classes at this point, and none of them have come close to the level of detail that this course provides. I'm still nowhere near finished this course alone because of just how much is actually included in it, but damn, the brushes that are provided with the course are incredible on their own. But the fact that there's a whole section dedicated to explaining how to use each one to achieve specific looks and effects really impressed me. I've already learned so many new techniques, some of which I've used to make the art in this video, and I'm not even halfway done. I would highly recommend both this course and Wingfox as a whole, because the quality and versatility that they offer is so valuable when it comes to improving your art quickly. I'd personally recommend the digital painting course that I'm currently working on, linked in the description, but I've also heard very good things about their Live 2D VTuber model course, and it's next on my list when I'm done this one. Honestly, Wingfox's courses are already pretty affordable considering just how thorough and extensively detailed they are, but on top of that, you can get 15% off any of their courses with coupon code WFF15. Online education has been hands down the biggest and most helpful tool I've used in the past year of working to improve my art, and I cannot recommend it enough. Moving on from education, though, another thing that I found really integral to my growth has been setting reasonable expectations for that growth. Wanting to go from amateurish mediocre art to league splash art overnight was absolutely demolishing my self-esteem and motivation, and I would absolutely have given up if I'd kept up that mentality. It's one thing to have something like that as a long-term goal, and it's a good thing, because that goal has helped push me to work harder. But to expect yourself to reach that goal without having to reach the million other smaller goals between now and then is just setting yourself up for failure. You won't be able to meet your own impossible expectations, and every time you make a piece that doesn't, you're gonna hate it, and your self-esteem and motivation will suffer as a result. Because if you're looking at your work through the lens of, is it as good as this person's, or is it as good as I want it to be, all you'll see is that it's not, and then you won't see all of the small improvements that you have made because they'll be overshadowed by the ones that you haven't. It's something that I actually learned in training for the organization I work with, but it's very applicable here too, and it's that you should always strive for excellence, not perfection. Striving for perfection will always leave you disappointed and unable to achieve it, and that'll feel like a personal failure. Striving for excellence, instead, encourages you to always do your best while also maintaining reasonable and achievable expectations. And when you end up meeting those expectations, that positive reinforcement will feel so validating that it'll encourage you to keep working and moving forward. What I've found very helpful specifically is starting every new art piece with one goal. Try to make this one better than the last one. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be as good as I want my art to eventually be. It just has to be a little bit better. I've also found it helpful to set specific goals for each piece, like individual areas that you want to work on improving. Anatomy, shading, hair, eyes, whatever. That way you'll be consciously working on and paying attention to those aspects throughout the drawing process, and then you can look at those aspects of the finished piece and feel some kind of tangible, visible reassurance that you've improved, even if only slightly or in one way. Improvement is such a slow, gradual process, and while I understand the urge to do it as quickly as possible as much as any other artist does, it's immensely important to acknowledge the small victories along the way, too. Another thing that's helped me a lot is a practice that I've briefly discussed before, and it's to analyze the art that you like, or art that you want yours to look like, and break it down into components. First of all, it makes that art less unattainable. I'm sure a lot of you have looked at a piece of art and thought, holy shit, there's no fucking way I'll ever be able to make something like that. I know I have. I still do. Often. Too often. But taking that art apart through analysis allows you to see it less as this perfect masterpiece that you don't know how to make, and more as the culmination of a bunch of different skills and techniques, all of which you could learn and use to make your own masterpiece. Not only that, but being able to see those aspects and techniques as individual areas to learn and practice allows you to be cognizant of those areas every time you work on your own art. It's so much easier to improve when you have a list of things that you want to change or refine, rather than just a nebulous, I want my art to be better, or like this other art, without any real plan or way to make that happen. I've also found that it's handy when it comes to developing your art style, because being able to look at a bunch of different artists' work and say not just, I like this, I want to draw like this, but I love the use of bright contrasting color, or I love the thickness of the line art, or I love the way they stylize the eyes. It helps you incorporate those aspects into your own art. So eventually, with enough time and practice, you kind of end up developing a style full of all the things that you loved and envied from other artists. At least that's what happened for me. I started the year trying to just simulate the League art style with no goals beyond make it look like that, and ended up not only failing to, but erasing my own style in the process. I still did learn a lot from trying to emulate that style, because doing that is a very valid and helpful form of art study in and of itself, so long as you do so as an exercise and not a long-term solution. But when I started looking at it more objectively and analyzing and setting goals, it stopped being, I want my art to be just like this art, and started being, how can I incorporate these aspects and techniques into my own art style? And I grew so much more with that attitude instead. The next thing I learned over the past year was the importance of studies. I used to only draw when the goal was to make a finished piece out of whatever I was working on. Every sketch had to turn into a fully rendered piece of art to be shared, if not sold. I felt like just sketching or drawing for the sake of a study and not posting or selling the finished art somehow, all of that was just a waste of time, if nothing could be gained from it. Which was partially because I was just exceptionally busy. That part hasn't really changed, it's just that now, at least once a week, I try to put a couple of hours aside in my schedule to just draw for study. I don't post those studies, I even delete most of them, but it's been so valuable in my growth to keep doing them. I learned that not only was not studying hindering my growth because I mean, studying is important. But because I was only ever drawing things that I would turn into finished works, I was also inherently limiting the kinds of things that I was drawing. I was drawing a very specific, small number of poses, body types, and perspectives, because the finished product had to meet certain criteria to be marketable. But in doing studies that I never sell or even post, I don't need to worry about whether or not someone will want to buy what I'm working on. I can draw a geriatric old man doing aggressive cartwheels to improve my understanding of the human body, and there's no concern that that subject matter won't be appealing to audiences or buyers. It really helped me start diversifying the kinds of things that I draw in that regard, and I feel like those studies were where my anatomy finally started improving. Art studies are also particularly valuable because if you're not worried about anyone seeing them, you don't have to worry about them being good. You can take risks, draw things you've never drawn or aren't good at drawing, and in doing so get better at drawing them, because they're allowed to be bad. No one can judge the quality of your art if no one sees it. At least for me, for that reason, it's been as therapeutic as it has been helpful. As a small follow-up tip for that, I've recommended pose packs in the past, but they're particularly relevant here. Pose packs, like Rachel Bradley's, which I'll never stop promoting because they're awesome, are collections of photos of real people in a variety of different poses, intended to provide reference to artists of all kinds. Some are free and some aren't, but the bottom line is that when it comes to studies, it's really handy to take a small pack of these poses and just sit down and draw them all, or at least a few of them. It teaches you proper anatomy by nature of it being based on a photo of a real person. It forces you to draw a person in poses you might not otherwise have been inclined to draw or even think of, and it prompts more diversity in the work that you're able to do. Personally, the ones that have been most helpful for me have been those with really dramatic perspectives that I'd never worked with before, and those with very extreme poses that don't really occur normally outside of like gymnastics or cinematic levels of action, because they push me out of my comfort zone, which has a lot of value, at least to me. Following up on that, the use of reference as a whole is something that I've learned to value and take a lot more seriously. There's actually a whole section on reference compilation in the Wingfox course I mentioned earlier, which is not uncommon. I've taken quite a few courses that emphasize the importance of good references for your work, and it's because having a comprehensive collection of reference images for every aspect of the piece you're working on makes all the difference when it comes to the quality of the finished art. Before this year, I would use one reference or maybe two at most per piece, and only for the aspects of the piece that I really struggled with, or design reference in the case of fan art. Now I have like 3 references ready for a fucking sleeve alone, and it's not because I don't know how to draw that sleeve without them. It's because with reference I can draw it better, and the more I draw something correctly because I drew it while looking at a reference, the better I'll be able to draw it without that reference in time. I would really recommend learning more about proper reference collection, because before I started studying this past year, I was always under the impression that using a reference really just meant looking at a picture of a pose or occasionally a piece of clothing or hair. I was incredibly surprised to learn that for a lot of industry professionals, they have pages upon pages of reference, all for one piece. Lighting reference, pose reference, hair reference, clothing reference, design reference, composition reference, the list goes on. And the more I've implemented this practice in my own work, the better that work has come out. So the bigger practices aside, here are some more general tips that I've learned over the last year that might be helpful for you guys. First, layers are an excellent asset for digital art, and their usefulness cannot be understated. But there is such a thing, at least in my experience, as using too many. And not just because I've hit the layer limit on every drawing program I've ever used after losing every individual detail to the growing, overwhelming sea of unnamed layers with 3 lines on each. I've also found that the more layers I use, the more separate I keep each different aspect of my art. And subsequently, the more disconnected and detached from each other those aspects end up turning out in the end. I still struggle a lot with light and reflection, but even if I can't always implement it well, I have learned that technically speaking, based on how light reflects, colors are not, in reality, fully bracketed out from each other just because they're separate. For example, if you hold up like a bright pink sweatshirt sleeve next to your cheek, that pink doesn't end where the sleeve does. Light reflects some of it onto your cheek. By separating layers so rigidly, at least in my experience, I've struggled to capture that, because it forces those colors not to blend into each other. I'm sure others are perfectly capable of portraying this effect even with their layers being separate, but in my personal experience, it's at least easier if you use less layer, and let those colors and aspects of your art blend together more. Another color-related tip is one that I actually learned from a Lavender Town video, linked in the card above, and it's about color palettes. Prior to this year, I would always either just use the exact designated colors of a character's palette in my work for accuracy's sake, or I would use a dramatized color palette and change the character's colors to fit into it, and disregard accuracy. The former led to a lot of colors clashing, and the latter led to me struggling to maintain the bright and bold coloring style that I favor when I had to conform to any kind of color scheme that didn't fit the palette I already made. But with this trick, you can make any group of colors go together, avoiding either scenario. Basically, you take the colors you want to use and you overlay one background color of your choice on top of that layer. Then you adjust the opacity of that layer as needed to suit how vibrant you want your palette to be. And you've got a brand new set of colors that works much better together. It's super simple, but I found it really helpful and I've used it a ton over the past couple months. The last color related note I want to mention is also simple, but I always used to do my shading and highlights in only one color, and then I would use that same color to airbrush wider, softer shadows or lights. It left the whole piece ending up looking pretty flat, and it also made the detail of the shading a lot harder to see. Making a conscious effort to use multiple shades and hues during this process has made a big difference for me, and I would really recommend experimenting with it if you don't already. Okay, one more thing that helped me improve my art was focusing more on line art. I used to use really thick line art that was pretty uniform in weight throughout the piece, and the more I studied this past year, the more I learned that unless that's purely out of stylistic preference, that's really not the way to go. I found that my line art really improved when I started using thicker line art for areas that are closer to the foreground, and thinner line art for areas that are farther away or for small details, as well as thickening the line art in areas of shadow or where lines touch or intersect. Playing around with brush settings, stabilizers, and pen sensitivity was also really helpful when it came to that. And that about covers the most helpful things that I've learned this past year. All of these methods and tips were integral in my growth, and while I still have a very long way to go in terms of improving my art, I'm genuinely so proud of how far I've come with it, after dedicating my time and energy to actively try to learn over the year. I've been amazed to see how much can be achieved when you really try to be conscious of the way that you're drawing and then the way that you want to be drawing. I've grown more this year than I did in the entire 10 years before it, and I think that says a lot about how the way you approach art can impact its quality. I hope at least some of this advice was helpful, and I'd love to hear about your guys' journeys with art and improvement in the comments. Especially the simple things that you tried out that ended up helping you a lot in the long run. Because I found that everyone has a handful of those things that are unique to them and their experiences, and I love hearing them. I also love stealing them for my own art improvement. Anyway, before I end the video, the announcements. First of all, hold on. Look at me! After months of work and waiting, VTuber Celestia is finally here. I'm so excited to start using this model for streaming, and based on the votes I received on my last poll, as well as my own schedule, I've decided that my weekly stream day will be Wednesdays at 6 p.m. MDT. I haven't decided on a debut date for my first one yet, because this month has been a hectic disaster of medical tests and crises. But hopefully in April, my schedule will be clearer and I'll be able to get this shit started. And when I do, I'm so excited to start chatting and drawing with you guys. I've got a handful of art-based games to play lined up, I'll be doodling a bunch of memes, and I'll be jumping on another bandwagon to smash and pass Pokemon and celebrate the debut stream. I'm really looking forward to getting started with this, so I hope to see some of you guys there. That aside, I've also released a bunch of new merch, shown on screen here, and I've also launched a brand new Patreon. You can find all of that linked in the description, and my Patreon tiers offer a bunch of new content and perks, so I'd really appreciate it if you checked it out. Finally, in my next video, I'll be announcing the first of many future art contests with some very cool prizes, so stay tuned for that as well. Okay, alright, I'm done rambling now, I'm sorry. Thank you guys for watching. Special thanks as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Lotus Dreams Art, Joseph Solomon, Adele Juarez, Fiona Paulo, and Oko Nova for their support. I hope you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in my next one.